if you think the most important thing in life is something you're going to achieve in the future, you kind of leave your mind constantly in a state of suspense and it's uncertain. So it naturally makes you anxious. Like, because what if I don't achieve it? Like, what if something gets in the
Mhm.
way? Then I'd lose the thing that everything hangs on. Whereas if you think, no, what matters is the journey and the way that I go about doing things, nobody can take that away from you, really. And it's something that can be there continuously, and it's something that even if you strayed from, you can continually reconnect with.
Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. My guest today on Podcast for Inquiry is Donald Robertson. Donald is a writer, cognitive behavioral psychotherapist, and a trainer. He is one of the founding members of the Modern Stoicism nonprofit and a founder and president of Plato's Academy Center nonprofit in Athens, Greece. Donald specializes in teaching evidence-based psychological skills and is known as an expert on the relationship between modern evidence-based psychotherapy and classical Greek and Roman philosophy. His work is highly interdisciplinary, combining philosophy, history, and psychology. My conversation with Donald starts with his book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, and traces the path of ancient Stoicism to the modern day. The word Stoicism had come to mean something very different over time, but that has started to change as Stoicism, the philosophy, has become more popular in recent years. Stoic principles lie at the heart of cognitive behavioral therapy, and Donald and I talk about how incorporating Stoic principles into one's own life can lead to more emotional resilience, a greater sense of life satisfaction, and more meaningful relationships with others. I'm very excited to bring you my conversation with Donald Robertson. Donald Robertson, thank you for talking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Uh, Me too. I read your book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, and right off the start, your first words in the book were, "When I was 13 years old, my father died of lung cancer," and that really hit me just right from the start because my father passed away from cancer as well. It wasn't lung cancer, but when I was only 10 years old. So that had I immediately felt that. I understood what that was like, and some of the hardships that you experienced. I had, a different path, but certainly something that I could understand. What I want to talk to you about is how you found Stoicism, because it's not something that when you were 13 would have been, very common and how it helped you and how it helps you today in an ancient philosophy helps you navigate today's world. So let's start with you're a teenager, you're having some difficulties, and your path from those difficulties to Stoicism to where you are today.
Yeah, so I got in a lot of trouble in Scotland when I was a teenager. I got kicked out of school actually when I was 16 and put on a rehabilitation scheme for young offenders. Um, so I didn't have any qualifications, virtually no qualifications, and things weren't looking very good for me. Um, but my father, when he passed away, he had been a Freemason. Um, my home Ayr is the birthplace of our national poet Robert Burns, and he was a master Freemason, and everyone knows that. And most of my friends' fathers were Freemasons as well. So my father left behind his books on Freemasonry, and for some reason I started looking at them, and I saw names like Pythagoras and Plato, and I saw the four cardinal virtues, which are symbolized by the four corners of a Freemasonic lodge. And that kind of piqued my interest, but I couldn't make head nor tail of it because it seemed to be a lot of symbolism and not much explanation. It's kind of cryptic, but it got me reading books about philosophy and history and stuff like that when I was fairly young. And then it kind of ramped up by the time I was about 15, 16, 17. I was reading Plato and stuff, and I ended up going to university because someone advised me to study philosophy. I studied Plato and Aristotle at Aberdeen University as part of my undergraduate degree, but I didn't study the Stoics because the Stoics are not part of the undergraduate curriculum normally. And the interesting thing is, it used to be that if you said to academic philosophers, many of my friends are academic philosophers today, if you said to them, "How come you guys don't study the Stoics?" They would say, "Well, you see, the Stoics mainly take concepts from earlier philosophers like Plato and Aristotle and others, and then they try to apply them to daily life in a practical way. So why would anybody want to study that?" They would say. And I thought that was kind of ironic, right? They were serious. They're not kidding. And I thought, but that's exactly why I want to study them, and that's the interesting bit. Uh, so I read after I graduated. I really began reading the Stoics, and particularly because I was interested in the intersection between philosophy and psychotherapy. I read a lot of stuff, obscure stuff about Wittgenstein and psychoanalysis, and I read a lot of stuff about existentialism and psychoanalysis. I studied Heidegger at university. My master's was in Jean-Paul Sartre and existential psychoanalysis. Um, and then I kind of like a lot of people when they study a subject in depth, they sometimes people persuade themselves it's not the right thing. They go off the idea, right? It's like people who go to university and study theology and end up becoming atheists. I studied existentialism and psychoanalysis and got so deep into it that I decided this stuff doesn't really make sense to me anymore, and I'm not finding it that helpful. So I thought I'd start again from scratch, and I began looking at cognitive behavioural therapy instead, and immediately realised there was a connection with ancient Stoic philosophy. The first modern cognitive therapist, Albert Ellis, in the mid 1950s. Um, Incidentally, Ellis had been a psychoanalytic therapist and did something very similar, so I warmed to him immediately for that reason. He got fed up with psychoanalysis and kind of basically threw all his books out and decided he was going to start again from scratch. And he'd read Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, and Marcus Aurelius. So curiously, he doesn't seem to have read much Seneca, who's the other main Stoic that we have writings from that survive today. But he mainly quotes a passage from the Enchiridion, or Handbook of Epictetus, that says it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. And Ellis quoted that to every single one of his clients, as far as I can tell, all of his students. He mentions it in virtually all of his many, many books. So it became a cliche in the cognitive behavioral therapy field. And I was very excited because I thought, oh, wow, I found an intersection that I hadn't realized between a whole different type of philosophy that I'd barely studied and a different type of psychotherapy. And so I went down a rabbit hole that was about 25 years ago. I'm still down the rabbit hole. I'm down this rabbit hole for a quarter of a century now, more than that probably. And something clicked for me. And I thought I was very interested in meditation, self hypnosis, kind of self improvement techniques. I was interested in psychotherapy, how psychology can be used to help people, and I was interested in philosophy as a sort of way of life. And I was reading different books on these different subjects. And then when I read the Stoics, somehow it all crystallized into one thing. And I distinctly remember saying to myself, because I guess maybe I felt like being a bit lazy. I thought I only need to read Seneca now. I don't need to read all these different books about Buddhist meditation and psychoanalytic therapy and analytic philosophy. I thought I could just read Seneca. He's kind of combining all three of my interests into one thing. And so that sent me off, and I realized Ellis drew quite heavily on the Stoics. And the strange thing was, though, that subsequent cognitive behavioral therapists mentioned that quote a lot, but I was all hyped up thinking they were going to talk about the parallels, and I was disappointed to discover that they hardly ever mention Stoicism beyond that one quotation, which struck me as very surprising because that quotation expresses the fundamental premise of cognitive therapy. You could call it the cognitive model of emotion. So, cognitive therapy and ancient Stoicism aren't just similar, they share this fundamental premise in common, and that causes them to arrive independently at a bunch of similar conclusions to some extent. They kind of end up paralleling each other. In modern CBT kind of reinvents the wheel in some regards, and so that caused me to get deeper into the subject. I studied it. I couldn't find a PhD supervisor. I did my masters in Sartre, and then I was going to I wanted to do my PhD in Stoicism and CBT, but at that time nobody would supervise that. Um, so I kind of gave up and pursued a clinical career as a psychotherapist instead, and I ended up taking my notes from my PhD and publishing them as a book called The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. And that was around about the time that Stoicism started to become popular. Uh, Partly, after the movie Gladiator, there was a big spike in interest in Marcus Aurelius, and Stoicism was progressively growing and gaining popularity anyway. Um, so we're now at the point where Stoicism is what the young people call a thing. Like it's almost like a genre of self-help now. There are countless books and articles and podcasts and stuff on it, and it makes even me cringe to hear myself saying this. But I was into Stoicism before it was cool. Like, and but I really was, and it's funny because I remember people saying to me, "Why would you want to study this nonsense? It's a sort of obscure niche in the field of philosophy that no one's really interested in except a handful of academics. Why would you bother?" Um, and that within a few years, that had all changed. Bill Irvine's book, um, what's it called? I've forgotten what it's called now, but it'll come back to me. Bill Irvine, the philosopher, wrote a book um, round about, I think it's 208 or 206 or something like that. I think there was the first best-selling modern book on Stoicism, and then Ryan Holiday wrote lots of books on
Hmm.
Stoicism that became multi-million bestsellers around the world, and now it's a thing that even celebrities are into. Um, so it's become very well established. Right back in the day, I was contacted like how long ago, 15 years ago or something, by Christopher Gill, who is a professor emeritus of ancient philosophy at the University of Essex. And Chris Gill, to cut a long story short, wanted to do some work on Stoicism and its practical application. And we ended up starting an organization, a non-profit called Modern Stoicism, which has annual conferences, has a blog with like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles from people around the world on the practical applications of Stoicism, has an e-learning course that runs every year, gathers data on the psychological effects of Stoicism. And so that's how it went from being something that I kind of stumbled into that I found personally helpful and I found helpful in my work as a therapist with clients. And then before I knew it, suddenly everyone else seemed to be into it. And I think there are several reasons for that.
Yeah,
Perhaps we could.
and I want to get into that.
Mhm.
So, if we look at, there was like a Stoic meetup. I'm in Toronto, and there was a Stoic meetup at least pre-pandemic. It kind of faded away, but it definitely has become more common. But still, when I talk to most people, and they and you mentioned Stoicism or what being Stoic means, it essentially it means in the vernacular in common parlance being emotionless and not allowing, not feeling anything, and just
Yeah,
stiff upper lip. And that's kind of true for not just Stoicism, but for other philosophies, right? Skepticism, where you just don't believe anything, or
yeah,
cynicism, right? These were grand historical philosophical traditions that, in common parlance, mean something very different. And you write in the book, when
yeah,
we speak of cynicism today, we mean something like an attitude of negativity and distrust, but that's only very tenuously related to the
yeah.
meaning of capital C cynicism. So I've got a two-part question for you. One
Okay.
is, I'd like you to explain what Stoicism is, like what the actual philosophy of Stoicism is, and why the word Stoic, as well as cynic and skeptic, have
Mhm.
come to mean something so very different than the philosophy on which that word is based. If you can speculate on that.
I'll answer that the other way around. And I'll add that the word Epicurean and the word sophistry
Right.
also
Yeah.
have
Other.
come
Yeah.
to mean,
Epicure. Yeah. But to be an Epicurean is very different than the philosophy of
yeah.
Epicureanism. Yeah.
Some restaurants are called Epicurus and stuff. That people think to be an Epicurean today means to enjoy fine dining, whereas it meant something very different to the followers of Epicurus in the ancient world. So there are many names, or several names of ancient philosophies have become. Their meaning has become degraded in popular language. And just to amplify what you said, generally speaking, now when we're talking about the modern kind of popular use of these words, we write them in lowercase. And when we're talking about the ancient philosophies, we usually capitalize them to make the distinction clear. So you could say, what's the difference between lowercase stoicism and capital S stoicism, is how people sometimes phrase it. Well, lowercase stoicism means having a stiff upper lip, being unemotional, or in slightly more technical terms, it means suppressing or concealing unpleasant or embarrassing emotions. And there's a bunch of research on it. Many researchers around the world have carried out studies on lowercase stoicism from different perspectives um, in relation to mental health, physical health as well. And surprise, surprise, it's not good for your mental health. It's kind of toxic. I know people hate that word, but it's basically it's not very good for you. Like, ironically, people embrace low-code stoicism often because they think it's tough. But weirdly, the research tells us the opposite, that people who are lowercase stoic are more emotionally fragile and vulnerable normally. They're more prone to developing depressive and anxiety disorders and running into other problems. And there's some obvious reasons for that. One is that the lowercase Stoics, people, you could call it a coping style or a personality type. People who fit that description don't seek emotional support from their friends or family, and they don't usually go and see therapists or counselors. So that fact alone will tend to mean they're on their own. You're on your own, buddy. Like, and so they usually don't cope as well in the long run because they're lacking support. But also the fact that they try to suppress or conceal emotions usually just backfires for a bunch of simple psychological reasons. They People like that often see anxiety as a threat, but the more you see anxiety as a threat, the more you'll naturally allocate attention to it, and that has the opposite of the desired effect. It's like putting it under a magnifying glass and making it blow up, and then you get second order anxiety. So you become ashamed of your anxiety and anxious about experiencing it or other people seeing it. Now you're anxious about your anxiety. You tie yourself in knots psychologically if you're not careful. So not good. Whereas, as we mentioned earlier in passing, Stoicism is the inspiration for modern cognitive behavioral therapy, and there are hundreds of studies that show that cognitive therapy is good for your mental health. Clues in the name, it's a therapy, right? So, what do we have is lowercase Stoicism, which research shows is bad for your mental health, and capital S Stoicism, which there's reason to believe is probably good for your mental health. And so, we really wouldn't want to confuse these two things. That would be disaster city. And yet, the internet, as always, is awash with influencers who confuse these two things repeatedly. And so that's quite unfortunate. And so anyone that's interested in Stoicism will usually put a lot of effort into distinguishing them, basically. And I could talk at great length about the differences between them. But the shorthand version is, apart from the fact that there's research that suggests that one's bad and the other's good for you, the I'll say something that's kind of trying to dig beneath the surface a little bit. That I think psychologists and philosophers talk about something called folk psychology. So, folk psychology is our default psychology, it's our culture, our language. We have assumptions about how the mind works, we have assumptions about how emotions work, and stuff like that, that are embedded into the very way that we talk. which would be great. It's kind of convenient, as long as they're kind of accurate. Sadly, they're not. Like they're woefully inaccurate, right? But we're stuck with them, really. I mean, it's often said that our folk psychology is kind of Cartesian, dualist. So we talk as if the mind and body are these two separate things that somehow interact with each other. Like that in itself is kind of notoriously problematic as a way of understanding the nature of the mind. But we're here talking about emotions, so let's talk about the other problem, which is that people tend to talk about their emotions as if they're like a lump of energy. Sometimes the default assumption about emotions is described as a hydraulic model. And the hydraulic model is that anger or anxiety kind of wells up inside you, like some kind of amorphous energy, and it builds up pressure or intensity, and you can try and kind of suppress it or push it down, or you can vent it and kind of purge it out of your system somehow, or you can channel it into things like going to the gym or something like that. Like you're channeling water that's building up pressure behind a dam or something. That's roughly how people talk about it. However, in reality, our emotions are more complex and multi-component than that. So, anger, for example, anxiety, they're more like a recipe that consists of multiple ingredients that you have to combine in a certain way to get a particular type of emotion. And some aspects of our emotions are voluntary, and
Mhm.
some aspects are involuntary, and some aspects are to do with sensations and action tendencies, and some have to do with various types of beliefs and patterns of thinking. And it makes a big difference if you understand emotion in this more nuanced way. Now, when people talk about lowercase stoicism, they're kind of assuming the folk psychology model or hydraulic model. So, oh, anxiety or kind of emotional hurt, you should just try and kind of suppress it or kind of conceal it and stuff like that. That's so people have a repertoire of coping strategies that they use to deal with their emotions. Um, but the problem is if your concept of what an emotion looks like and how it functions is really crude and simplistic, you're going to use really crude and simplistic coping strategies that often aren't very helpful. Like you're going to just try and suppress your emotion or kind of vent it or whatever. Um, but the Stoics understood that our emotions are largely cognitive in nature, that when we feel anxious, it's typically to some extent because we believe something catastrophic is about to happen and we won't be able to cope with it. When I feel angry, by contrast, it's often because I think somebody's done something that they shouldn't have done, and maybe even that they deserve to be punished for doing it. And when I feel sad or depressed, it's often because I think I have a negative belief about myself, that I'm a worthless person or useless individual or something like that. So different types of emotion tend to be associated, broadly speaking, with different types of belief and attitude. But once you realize that, it's a game changer. Like, because if you understand that uh, Albert Ellis, who I mentioned earlier, for example, clients used to speak to Albert Ellis and they'd talk about how depressed or anxious or angry they were. And when people talk long enough about their emotions, in a sense, what they're giving you is a list of reasons why they should change. So it's destroying my relationships, it's giving me stomach ulcers, it's ruining my sleep. Like, these are all motives to stop being angry, for example. But so you're building this up, building this up, building this as you describe the nature of the problem. So usually people reach what's sometimes called a point of stuckness, and then they'll say, "But I can't help it. I know it's awful. It's destroying my life and annoying everyone else around me, and it makes me feel awful. But I can't help it. It's just the way I feel." And so they're stuck. So the other thing is when we have this default theory of emotion, we often feel that there's not much that we can do to control this ball of energy, this blob of anxiety that's welling up within us, or anger. It's just how I feel. This anger comes and it comes from within me somewhere. I don't know where. And Ellis used to smile and lean forward and say, yes, but it's not just how you feel, is it? It's also how you think, because emotions are more than we normally realize cognitive in nature. And once you realize that your emotions are shaped to a large extent by underlying beliefs and attitudes, then they're cognitive in nature. Uh, that opens up a whole toolbox of cognitive therapy techniques that suddenly become relevant and helpful, which wouldn't have made sense in if we, as long as we assume the kind of default or hydraulic model of emotion. And cognitive therapy works. So the research that shows that cognitive therapy is effective lent indirect support to ancient Stoicism. And that's one of the reasons that Stoicism, since the 1960s, has been slowly building in popularity, and now it's seen as more credible and more plausible than it was for a while in the past.
Yeah, about oh gosh, it was probably 8 or 9 years ago now. I went through a very difficult period in my life. My marriage had fallen apart. I was separated and then divorced, and it's not easy for anybody. And that is when that's when I found when I found Stoicism, and the key insight that helped me through a very difficult period from Stoicism was that you can't control what other people do. Other people are
Yeah,
going to do things that you like. Sometimes they're going to do things that you don't like, that you don't approve of. Sometimes
yeah,
you don't have control over that. But what you
yeah,
can have control over, or what you have some influence over, is how you react to that, and what, like, how much you're going to let that affect you. And so I did a bit
yeah.
more reading, and one of the things that I discovered was that there isn't much of the written record left of what the Stoics actually said. And you comment on that in your book. You write that the Stoics were prolific writers, but probably less than 1% of their writings survive today. And like, we have Epictetus, we have Marcus Aurelius, we have Seneca, but not much else. So my question is, how can we say with confidence what Stoicism is, or what the principles of Stoicism were and are, when
Uh-huh.
there's so little to base it on? Is it uh, how do we know that when we talk about Stoicism today, that it bears much of a resemblance to what was actually believed and practiced, uh, a couple thousand years ago? And also, I guess, why is there so little remaining? Why has so much been lost to the ravages of time?
Well, let's see. There's a few questions there. So let's start wide and say with your last question, and say because it's generally true that classical literature in general has largely been lost, and only a small percentage of it has survived. Because things like the dialogues of Plato were perceived as being so important that they were preserved um, throughout the centuries. But for various reasons, historically, um, only a small fraction of ancient literature in general survives today. And that might surprise people because we kind of think that we've got a lot of stuff, but there's a lot more stuff that we don't have. Why was that? To be honest, it was because it was difficult to reproduce. So scrolls and books were very precious. There might only be a limited number of copies of them. They were often stored in great libraries, which is makes sense, but it's problematic if the library burns down or it's looted, then they're all gone suddenly, poof, like that. And so that happened throughout history. There were various fires, sieges, things were stolen, destroyed, sold on, disappeared from history. And then with the Christianity becoming the state religion of the Roman Empire, pagan philosophy was viewed in a negative light. And so that led to the suppression of some literature as well. So it's a miracle that we have anything, to be honest. But we're lucky to have some of the Stoic literature. We have lots of bits and pieces of other stuff, right? So we mainly, what people are most familiar with would be the discourses of Epictetus and his handbook, the letters and dialogues of Seneca, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, which is his personal notes. Um, we also have some lectures by Musonius Rufus. We also have Cicero. Cicero was not a Stoic, famous statesman and orator. He was a follower of the academic school of philosophy, but he was highly educated. He'd been to Athens and a great writer. So we have extensive writings by Cicero where he talks about Stoicism. And we have also writings by Plutarch where he criticizes the Stoics, for example, and a
Ah,
bunch of other bits and pieces of fragments, right? So if you took all of that um, to roughly quantify it, I would say we have maybe uh, 8 volumes-ish of surviving writings on Stoicism. I guess depending on how you want to combine them or carve them up. So we have a decent amount of literature. Most of it comes from the late Roman period, the imperial Roman period of Stoicism. Stoicism flourished for nearly 500 years in the ancient world. That's a long time. Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, like, their teachings flourished for like a century or whatever, a bit more. But Stoicism flourished as a thriving philosophical school for 500 years. And then it kind of continued to have some influence on Christianity and then re-emerged to some extent in the Renaissance. So we, what was I going to say? We have mainly these later thinkers. And so the annoying thing about that, if you like, is they're not really laying out the foundations of Stoicism systematically. For example, the best known book on Stoicism is Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, which is not meant to be like a lecture on Stoicism 101. It's Marcus Aurelius applying Stoicism to his
mhm.
own personal life. So he takes it for granted that he knows what Stoicism is and how it works. To modern readers, they might not even realize that he's sometimes using technical vocabulary, he's using formulaic arguments and techniques in that book. So he's assuming a highly systematic, long standing philosophical tradition. But I think people can still understand what he's saying, even though sometimes they might need the help of modern scholarly commentary to kind of read between the lines and maybe figure out what the wider philosophical system looked like. We do, for example, from Cicero, have something approaching Stoicism 101. Cicero has a book called De Finibus, which is a series of dialogues. And there's an Epicurean, there's an academic philosopher, there's a Stoic, and they describe their philosophies. The Stoic in the dialogue lays out the foundations of Stoic ethics in a more systematic manner. So from all of that material, even though a lot of it is kind of assuming stuff about Stoicism, we can see there are clearly recurring themes, and modern scholars can kind of infer what the basic principles of Stoicism were. And so Cicero, for example, clearly states in De Finibus something that I'll come to in a moment, which is the central doctrine of Stoicism. And Epictetus refers to it in a different language a number of times. So we can see, there's gaps in our knowledge, but luckily they talk quite a lot about what their core principles are. So we can reconstruct a fairly good understanding of that by sort of triangulating all this different information. So I should say, you actually asked me earlier, what do the Stoics believe? And I talked about the sort of psychological implications of Stoicism. Stoicism um, was primarily an ethical philosophy, however, and its central doctrine, according to Cicero, was that virtue is the only true good. So this is a radical idea because other philosophers thought maybe the goal of life or human flourishing consisted in having a certain type of character that was maybe wise, just, self-disciplined, courageous, and so on, and maybe also having a bunch of money and a lot of friends and things like that. And so these things combined maybe constitute what human flourishing looks like. But the Stoics adopted a hard line that says no, human flourishing consists entirely in these character traits. And the external things like wealth and reputation are nice if you can get them. They're what they call preferred indifference. They're not completely indifferent. It's natural to prefer them. However, they're not intrinsically part of what constitutes human flourishing. So that, for example, they might illustrate that by saying Socrates was ridiculed and sentenced to execution in ancient Athens. He lived in relative poverty, at least for a man of the hoplite class, went around barefoot and had owned very little property. But would his life have been improved if we gave him a load of money and made him more popular? Like, so they say, well, really, Socrates flourished because despite poverty and despite being ridiculed, he rose to the occasion and exhibited tremendous wisdom and strength of character. And maybe, if he'd had an easy life and lots of friends and lots of money, he wouldn't have had the opportunity to exercise those virtues. So, paradoxically, they might say it's not clear that Socrates' life would have been improved just by giving him more money. So the Stoics believe that it's our virtue is the only true good, whereas the majority of people, the default philosophy in ancient society and in modern society is that the goal of life and flourishing consists in having stuff, like having a garage packed with stuff and having a nice car and a big house and a beautiful wife and a great job and all of this kind of stuff. And the Stoics want to say that's not really what fulfillment or human flourishing fundamentally consists in. These are really just advantages in life. And what matters is whether you use them well or use them badly. All of these things could potentially ruin your character, like or you could use them wisely.
Right. Like there's
And in
people
a
who win the lottery and then 2 years later
Yeah,
they're bankrupt and miserable.
they're surrounded by hangers on. They don't have any real friends anymore, and they blow it all on hard drugs and endless women,
Right.
like or loose men, And so the Stoics would say, yeah, like it requires wisdom and strength of character to actually use these external advantages well. If you give a big bag of money to an evil dictator, it's not going to improve the quality of it. It's just going to make him do more evil, vicious things. If you give someone who's really foolish and reckless a lot of money and a lot of power, they're just going to do more foolish and reckless things with it. So they think it's not these advantages that contribute to flourishing, but what matters is the way that we use them, and whether we use them wisely and virtuously or foolishly and viciously. Now, I want to emphasize there's a missing link here, which is so Stoicism is this kind of hardline ethical philosophy. How did we get to cognitive behavioral therapy from that? And the answer is people immediately realized that if somebody genuinely embraced the Stoic U-turn or radical change in our fundamental values, it would mean that they would be less perturbed if someone took away their money or damaged their reputation. So the Stoic sage or the Stoic ideal of the perfect wise man, they have this hypothetical idea of if someone were to completely follow this philosophy, what would their life be like? The ideal of the sophos or the sage. The Stoic ideal would be emotionally resilient, basically, because he would be unfazed by the kind of setbacks that normally distress the majority of people. And for that reason, there's always been a connection. Strangely as it may seem, that Stoicism starts as an ethical philosophy, but it quickly leads to a doctrine of emotional resilience, and that's how it ended up being connected with modern psychotherapy. There's one little bit of trivia I'll add because it may be this would shock people. So I think many people assume that modern psychotherapy began with Sigmund Freud or something like that, and they think of psychotherapy as kind of a modern phenomenon, largely, right? Everything about that is wrong. For a start, Freud himself trained in psychotherapy and Charcot at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris, and in a place called Nancy under a guy called Hippolyte Bernheim. So modern psychotherapy had been around for about half a century before Freud even came on the scene, right? But it's not modern anyway. Psychotherapy existed in the ancient world. Like, not everything is new. In the ancient world, they studied rhetoric and they studied logic and they studied psychotherapy. They call it therapia of the psyche. And there were entire books written on it by philosophers of different schools. Most of them are lost. So there was the most famous one was by the third head of the Stoic school, Chrysippus, who wrote a book on therapeutics, on psychotherapy, that was very influential. We don't have it, but we have some other books that refer to it or quote it. We do have Seneca's book on anger, though, which is an entire book dedicated to Stoic psychotherapy for anger specifically. And we have other bits and pieces of evidence that let us reconstruct it. So it's not just that Stoicism was this kind of philosophy that somehow inspired that psychotherapy. Stoicism was a philosophy that already had a psychotherapy associated with it, and then everyone forgot about it. And we kind of rediscovered it like 2,000 years later.
Yeah,
Because,
there are a couple of quotations from your book that I think kind of really brought home for me the focus on character, and one was a quotation from Marcus Aurelius when he writes, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be, just be one." And I thought that was a very powerful statement. But then, for a more practical example, like something that you can translate today, you wrote about halfway through the book that readers should make two short lists side by side, and in one column you should write desired, and that, like, these are the things that you most desire for yourself in life.
mhm,
And then in another column, you title that column admired, and the qualities that you find most praiseworthy and admirable in other people. And then you look at
yeah,
those two lists, and if they're quite different, to contemplate why the things that you respect most in others are not what you
yeah,
want for yourself. And
yeah.
so, can you tie that into how that is a practical instantiation of capital S Stoicism?
The Stoics were heavily influenced by preceding schools of philosophy. In particular, they seem to be big fans of Socrates. Epictetus idolizes Socrates in particular. And so you can see Socrates as the kind of godfather or the granddaddy of Stoicism in some regards. And Socrates had this method called the Socratic method that involves questioning people about their beliefs and exposing contradictions in their thinking. And he used that in a number of ways. He very explicitly uses it as a therapy. He refers to it as a therapy. And particularly, mainly, most famously, we have dialogues portraying Socrates that were written by his student Plato. But we also have dialogues written by another one of his students called Xenophon, about 40 odd shorter dialogues by Xenophon. They're a little bit different than Plato's dialogues. And it presents Socrates in a kind of more down to earth light. Even in Plato, Socrates sometimes seems to be doing therapy, but sometimes he's kind of doing metaphysics as well. But in Xenophon, it's more obvious that Socrates is doing a sort of cognitive therapy. In at least two of the dialogues, he's literally speaking to friends or family members who have relationship problems, who are angry with other people, and Socrates is using the Socratic method and questioning them about their anger in order to help them overcome it and cause them to become reconciled to these people that they've had an argument with. So it looks like he's doing relationships counseling. He's clearly doing some types of therapy. Like, sometimes people think it's great. It seems like a stretch to say that Socrates is doing therapy, and they say just look at these dialogues. Like, in those ones, it's really clear that he's doing something that resembles a cognitive therapy or relationships counseling. Um, so this idea uh, of one of Socrates' methods that we see him employing several times in Plato and in Xenophon, I would describe today as double standard strategy. So Socrates exposes contradictions in our thinking, and sometimes he does that by asking people how they view others. So there's a dialogue in Xenophon where a young man called Euthydemus comes to see Socrates. He's probably like 15, 16, 17, and he's kind of embarking on public life. It's very kind of central to aristocrats and well-off people in Athens to become public speakers and prominent in the assembly and in the law courts and so on. And he wanted to network. Weirdly, he's asking Socrates for advice about networking. He's like, "You know everybody, Socrates. Could you introduce me to some people that would be good friends to have in life? I'm planning my future here." And Socrates says, "Well, that sounds like a very noble, desire to have to make good friends." And Socrates usually starts off with an easy question, and so people would often ridicule him for sounding like he was rambling and asking simple questions. They thought you're like a child, Socrates, with these ridiculous questions about sheep and things like that, and carpenters and shoemakers and whatnot. It's like not nonsense. So he says, what are the qualities that you'd look for in a good friend? And Euthydemus says, well, they'd lend me money when I need it. They'd share my values. They'd come and visit me when I was sick. Maybe they'd tell me if I was acting badly in a polite, tactful way. Blah, de, blah, de, blah, right? Because it's pretty fairly easy to list the typical qualities that you'd look for in a good friend. But then Socrates flips it round and says, well, how many of these qualities do you have, buddy? And Euthydemus is kind of nonplussed, and basically he doesn't really have any of these qualities himself. And Socrates says, well, you've approached this back to front. You've asked me how to introduce you to people that have the characteristics of a good friend, but you don't have those qualities yourself. So that would simply earn me a bad reputation as a matchmaker or somebody who makes introductions because they'd figure that out eventually, and it wouldn't really help you or them. You should have asked me, how do I become a good friend? And then not only I, but other people would be falling over themselves to introduce you to other people who have those qualities. Right? So his subtext is that he's basically saying you're too preoccupied with wanting to appear to people to be a good friend and not asking yourself how you would actually become one in reality. Socrates thinks people often make this error of being too caught up in appearances and not enough in focused on the underlying reality. So this is a contradiction. It's a double standard. He has standards for what he expects of friendship in other people, but he doesn't apply that standard to himself. It's you could say it's hypocritical of him, or it's a moral contradiction. And by exposing that and making people more aware of these double standards, which is something we sometimes do in modern psychotherapy, um, you can lead to having a more coherent, more integrated set of values and worldview. And it often helps us to deal with emotional problems. Like I would say, like, double standards are at the root of anger in many cases. Usually when we're angry with people, we're applying a different standard to their behavior than we would typically apply to our own. And so thinking this through using Socratic questioning, it leads to something that people call the golden rule, that's most familiar from Christianity. This idea that you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And this takes many forms. People say the golden rule crops up in different cultures around the world, in different philosophies, but it's implicit in Stoicism and in the philosophy of Socrates for a reason, that Socrates uses his method of questioning to expose contradictions in our thinking about our values. And when we do that, we often spot we're exercising a double standard, applying a double standard, and when we resolve that, it's like we're coming closer to following the golden rule as a rough guide to ethical living. So that's one aspect of it. Um, often we are misled by fear and desire into straying from our values. When we look at other people, it's easier to be objective, and we can think, well, what I really admire in other people is integrity. And listen, even if someone's really confused about their values, what you can find is that you can take a step back Occasionally today, I meet a lot of particularly young men that say they've got no idea what their values are and they're kind of nihilistic because they spent too much time on the internet or whatever, like they've got really confused and they'll say, I just don't know what my values are. I don't know, I don't have any sense of purpose or direction in life. And, I'm getting flooded with contradictory advice from different
Right. How do
influences.
I sort through all of
Head
the,
spinning,
yeah,
right? So even if you're really confused and you're not sure, usually people have a kind of gut sense of what they can't stand in other people. And it's fairly typical. Honestly, most people's values are broadly similar. Research on values shows they're more consistent than you would think. I mean, people agree about values in the abstract. Like most people agree that lying is a bit generally a bad thing, with some exceptions. That, torturing small children is usually a bad thing. There's a general consensus, maybe not shared by absolutely everybody, but most people admire qualities like wisdom and courage and self-discipline and so like the cardinal virtues, but they apply them differently in practice. That's where the differences really emerge. So you could say most people, if you ask them what they can't stand, funnily enough, almost always they'll refer to politicians. Like, maybe it's something about the very nature of politics. People go, I can't stand such and such politician, right? Whether it's in America, you've got one of two main options. Like, basically, it's going to be like, it usually like, would have been Joe Biden in his day or Donald Trump or whatever. Like, and then people get really worked up about how much they can't stand these politicians. And if you ask them why they can't stand them, they'll be like, because they're dishonest, they're corrupt, blah, 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 and they obviously feel really strongly about that. But if you feel really strongly that you can't stand corrupt, deceitful people, such as maybe certain politicians, you feel that way, that kind of implies that you value honesty and integrity. Even if you're not very aware of it, it's
mhm,
implicit in your condemnation of people that lack those virtues.
right. If
It's
you
the
don't know
flip
what you're
side.
for, but implicitly you're for the things that you are vehemently against. You're for the opposite of the things that you're vehemently against.
Yeah. And then if you value those qualities in other people, then like if you think a good friend would do such and such, if you think a good politician would do such and such, then do you possess any of those qualities yourself? And if not, like, suppose that you were to spend more time and effort developing honesty, integrity, wisdom, courage, self-discipline, whatever the qualities are that you really admire in other people. Like, suppose you were to become more like the people that you admire, what would be the consequences of that? And for most people, it's their life would change, their life would probably become more fulfilling, um, so you can see life as a battle between our values, our character-based values, and um, our desires and our fears, basically. Our fear and desire kind of pollute our vision and lead us astray, but they're not usually ultimately fulfilling. I'll tell you a little bit. Well, I'll sidestep here and link this to modern psychotherapy to maybe flesh out what I'm saying a little bit. In the treatment of clinical depression, um, it used to be that you would interview someone who's clinically depressed and say, hey, could you let's get the flip chart out. Make a list of all of the things that in the past you used to enjoy doing. Like, I used to love going to the movies with my friends. I really enjoy being around animals. I love playing music, blah, 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 blah. And then you would say, well, how many of these things have you done over the past week? And depressed people will often say, well, none of them. And then the therapist might say, well, if I made a list of all of the things that I enjoy doing most in life, and then I'd quit doing all of them, after a while, maybe I'd start to feel kind of down, like, and it would affect my quality of life somewhat, right? By definition. So it used to be believed that we need to identify pleasurable activities and schedule them and plan them so that depressed people make an effort to re-engage and do more of them. But the perspective shifted a bit over the last 20 years or so. And modern researchers in depression think it's not so much a deficit of pleasurable activities, but it's more a deficit in meaningful activities that contributes to clinical depression. And so the state-of-the-art treatment is a thing called behavioral activation. It's a form of behavior therapy for clinical depression that is startlingly similar to ancient virtue ethics. So it consists of two stages. The client clarifies their values, which are character-based values, like the qualities that they admire in other people, the qualities that they want their own life to stand for, their character strengths, like being a good parent, being a good colleague at work, and the traits that would define what a good parent or a good colleague is like. And then the second stage is activity scheduling, so planning changes in their daily routine that give them an opportunity to exhibit more courage, wisdom, integrity, or to acquire or develop more of those qualities. And when people do that, they become less depressed and they experience a deeper sense of not just pleasure, but fulfillment in life. Their life becomes more meaningful. And so that research, in a sense, validates the psychological benefits of ancient virtue ethics.
Yeah, that's
And,
it.
you
Was
know,
the episode. Our previous episode was also about virtue ethics, although I hadn't connected it really to Stoicism. But the intersection of virtue ethics and running or athleticism, and her thesis was that good people make better runners, and so that was a really interesting
that's
conversation.
interesting.
But seeing like the connections of how giving yourself a challenge and rising to an occasion is good, not just not if like in a physical sense where you are more fit, you're a bit healthier physically, but also emotionally and psychologically because you are improving yourself through effort and a bit of discipline and not taking just the path of least resistance.
That makes perfect. Chrysippus, who I mentioned earlier, as the third head of the Stoic school, was a long distance runner, incidentally. But let me give you a little example. It helps to illustrate. So that say there's two different types of value here. There's the extrinsic value of goals that like writing a best-selling book or passing an exam or making $1 million or something like that.
Right.
And then there's intrinsic value of the way that we do things or the character traits that we exhibit, the quality of our actions, creative, generous, self-disciplined, for example. They're two quite different sorts of values. So the majority of people tend to organize their lives around external goals or extrinsic values. And somebody might say, well, my big goal is to write a best-selling book. And, if I write a best-selling book, then I'll be happy, right? So that to me seems like the most important thing, or making $1 million, that seems like the most important thing. And if I could do that, like one day I'll be happy. Which seems like it kind of makes sense. But the problem with it is it's like you're sending a message to your brain that says, I cannot be happy until then. I'm going to be
Right.
unhappy
It also puts
until
like
I've,
the control,
yeah,
like the definition of when you're happy is based on the actions of others, sometimes like
yeah,
individuals, like publishing a book, or many people. If it has to be a
yeah,
best-selling book, then I can only be happy if all of you buy my book, and
yeah,
as opposed to I can do something in my own
yeah,
life with the things
yeah.
that I can do, and I can. I'm going to say like make myself happy. That's not the right way to phrase it, but like I can do
Mhm.
things that lead to my own happiness that don't need you, Donald, to do something for my happiness. That strikes me as a less fragile, more robust, and in a way healthier
There you
way
go.
of striving for contentment
Yeah.
or meaning or satisfaction.
E. It's almost like you're saying virtue ethics leads to emotional resilience, like
I
which
mean,
is yeah,
I'm not a virtue ethicist, but yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot in
yeah.
there that that makes that makes sense.
So one of the problems as well with, I mean, there are many problems with pursuing external goals, but another one is, it's in the goals. These are in the future, right? Well, you might get hit by a bus tomorrow. You might get hit by a bus. You might work and work and work on your career as a writer for a decade, and then get hit by a bus the day before your book becomes a bestseller, or the day before you make $1 million or something. Or you might make $1 million and then think woohoo, and then a week later lose it again. Like, or you might write a best-selling book and then your second book might be absolutely panned by everybody and they think it's just awful, or so on and so forth, right? So often what happens is even when you achieve the goal, you think, this is it, I've achieved this one thing that makes my life really important and valuable, and then you'll be really happy and fulfilled for like a day, and then you'll start to kind of think,
What's
maybe
next?
I maybe I maybe I need to write an even bigger bestseller. Maybe I need to make $2 million, or like you start moving on to the next thing. Now you're like, now I'm going to be unhappy until I write my second bestseller, or now I'm going to be unhappy until I make $10 million, right? And so you end up like on this perpetual treadmill of like pursuing this constantly receding carrot. Like occasionally you get the carrot, and then you just off after another carrot again. Um, Whereas what you think, but that's life. It sucks. But what would the alternative be? So the alternative would be this radical shift in perspective that says, you know, it would be nice if I wrote a best-selling book, but what's more important to me is that I feel that I'm exercising creativity and integrity as a writer. Or it'd be nice if I made $1 million, but it's more important to me to exercise wisdom and self-discipline as a businessman, or something like that, right? The qualities, right, that may lead to those goals, if I'm lucky, like are more
But
important to me
but
than
there's
the
no
goal.
guarantee, and
Yeah,
you're not making your happiness contingent on the
yeah,
being a successful businessman or best-selling writer. It's
and
how, I guess, character, your behavior that
yeah.
matters, not the results. Is
Your
that
character, yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there's a couple of differences there. One is, as you mentioned, some things are up to us and other things are not. These outcomes are never entirely under your control, and they're in the future.
Mhm.
Your virtues or your character is under your control. It's just the way that you choose to go about doing things. And it happens crucially, it always happens in the present moment, right? So by the way, anyone that's into mindfulness, it seems to me, and actually this is part of modern, what we call third wave cognitive behavioral therapy, is the idea that virtue ethics or this approach to values goes hand in hand with practicing mindfulness. Because if I believe that the most important thing in life is selling a best-selling book or making $1 million or something, or becoming famous on Instagram or whatever it is, like my mind is going to be constantly drawn towards the thing that I think is most important, which is a hypothetical future. It's going to be very difficult for me to actually practice mindfulness if by definition, I think that what's going on right now in my character is of negligible importance compared to what might happen off there in the future. I'm naturally going to pay most attention to where I place most value. So I can't, it's not helpful if I'm trying to practice mindfulness and have a set of values that are fundamentally antagonistic to doing that. Like my attention's over here, but my values are over there. That's not sustainable, right, for most people. Whereas if your values are in your character and you think the main thing is the way that I behave right now, then you're naturally going to turn your attention more towards the present moment in your actions. Now, think about it this way. Suppose there's two versions um, of you. There's one who's a virtue ethicist, or a stoic, and another one who pursues external goals like the majority of people do. And so this
Mhm.
guy, both of them are writing their masterpiece, and both of them get hit by a bus. Like it's a terrible, multiple tragedy, right? The day before the book gets published and it becomes an instant bestseller. And the pair of them are looking down from a hypothetical afterlife. And the guy that says, well, to me, the most important thing throughout all of my life was just to write a bestseller. And I worked for a decade and then I got hit by a bus the day before. So looking back at my life as a whole, to be honest, the whole thing seems kind of pointless and worthless now because it all hung on writing that bestseller and get hit by a bus just at the very last minute before it happened. Whereas the other guy might say, well, for me, the most important thing was it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it kind of thing. It was my character. and having creativity and self-discipline and integrity as a writer. And I did that every day of my life, more or less. And even though I get hit by a bus before I published a bestseller, which would be nice, still every single day of my life was valuable because every single day of my life, if I wasn't exhibiting integrity and creativity, I was at least trying to exhibit those characteristics. And so I can look on every day of my life that I remember to make that effort and think that's me doing the most important thing in life right there, all continuously, all the way through, right until the point I get hit by a bus. So, of course, this way of life is going to be intrinsically more rewarding, meaningful, and fulfilling. It's a trap to invest so much value in external goals. It robs, it drains the present moment. It drains your entire life of any intrinsic value or meaning. Like potentially, if you do that in an extreme way, and actually, there's research that shows that people that suffer from depression and generalized anxiety have a tend to place more value on future goals. If you think the most important thing in life is something you're going to achieve in the future, you kind of leave your mind constantly in a state of suspense and it's uncertain. So it naturally makes you anxious. Like, because what if I don't achieve it? Like, what if something gets in the
Hmm.
way? Then I'd lose the thing that everything hangs on. Whereas if you think, no, what matters is the journey and the way that I go about doing things, nobody can take that away from you, really, and it's something that can be there continuously, and it's something that even if you strayed from, you can continually reconnect with every day of your life. So it really is a much more fulfilling philosophy of life. So it's shocking. I mean, I'll tell you something that's shocking. This will scare the socks off you, right? If
Okay.
I am talking to a client and I get them to clarify what their values are, I ask them what things they most admire about other people. Um, one of the questions we could ask, we could list these values and we could say, so over the past week, how much time in minutes or hours have you spent doing stuff that was consistent with the value that you place on creativity or self-discipline or wisdom or whatever, right? Um, and so, I mean, we could quantify that, right? But the most common answer to that question, in my experience, it's not the only answer I hear, but the most common answer is zero, right? And that's kind of shocking. So you think, you just told me that the most important thing in life to you is to exhibit compassion or creativity or whatever it is. And you've told me you spent 0 minutes doing that over the past week. Something's not right here.
Hmm.
Something's wrong.
Right.
Something's gone seriously wrong.
It's not realistic to spend every minute of every day on those things, but to not spend any time on what
Yeah.
you most value, yeah, something is
Well,
seriously out of whack.
you're onto something there because actually, so people think, man, I'm going to have to turn my life around, and maybe I'll have to become a Buddhist monk or something like that. But actually, I mean, this is another crazy revelation. Just adding 5 minutes a day is often small changes often have quite a big impact. So 5 minutes a day would be a world apart from 0 minutes. Like, say
Hmm.
somebody really values creativity, and that's the number one most important thing, but they never do anything creative. They haven't for years. Like, even if they just spent 5 minutes a day doing something that was creative, like writing a couple of lines of poetry or something, and then ripping it up and throwing it in the bin, like, as long as that's something that at least for 5 minutes they find intrinsically valuable and fulfilling, that alone might change their whole quality of life. And then you can build out from that. But it doesn't have to be a massive transformation. Like it could just be making relatively small changes. The other thing that's kind of curious about this is that you'll also find many people who are already doing things that are in alignment with their core values, but they don't kind of notice that they are, right? So you don't get the weird thing is, um, it's almost like there's a gap between the ethics and the psychology here, which is you could be acting in a way that's consistent with your core values, but not gain the psychological benefits of it because you don't really connect the two in your mind. Maybe you're a great friend, to other people, and you listen to your friends and you ask how they're doing, and you exhibit many qualities of friendship. But somehow you've kind of lost sight of the fact that by doing that, you're exemplifying the virtues of friendship. And so it might be that you just do it automatically and habitually without really experiencing any sense of fulfillment or reward from doing it. Because you're lacking a form of mindfulness or self-awareness. You're doing it on autopilot and not even really registering what you're doing or how valuable it is potentially. So that's quite a sad thing, is that sometimes you'll see people that are living in accord with their values, but there's a disconnect there, so that they don't experience a sense of fulfillment from doing these things that they should be experiencing. But by reflecting on it and reconnecting with their values, integrating their values into their daily life, and being more mindful of how their values inform and link with those actions, then they can tap into the sense of fulfillment that's kind of theirs by right.
Yeah, Donald, this has been great. We've been talking for over an hour now. I feel like I could talk to you for at least another six. I have so many questions that I would like to ask you, but I want to be respectful of your time, and I want to say that also there is so much more to learn in your book, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And if today's conversation is of interest, was interesting to you, our listeners, then please go to the library, go to a bookstore, and pick up the book on the Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius. Uh, Donald, if people are interested in finding out more about you and your writings, how can they find you online, and what's next for you?
Well, they can find my books just by looking on Amazon or whatever, but they can also, my website is donaldrobertson.name, Name, instead of .com. And I'm pretty active on Substack. Like, I don't use X anymore. I gave up on that. But I put a lot of articles and I put podcasts out a lot on Substack. What I'm doing, I'm the president of a non-profit called the Plato's Academy Centre. We put on events about philosophy and its practical applications throughout the year. We've got a conference coming up on love and relationships in ancient philosophy and the advice that it can give us. My wife's organising that. Um, and I'm working on a book at the moment about anger, because that's my kind of my favourite subject. I love anger, and I find it fascinating. And I think of it as the royal road to self-improvement, because angry people are like soap dodgers. They're therapy and self-help dodgers. The anxious people and the depressed people buy books on self-help and they go and see therapists, but angry people don't, because they think everyone else needs therapy. It's you
Right.
guys that need to go and see a therapist, not
I'm
me.
fine. The rest of the world is stupid.
Yeah, you see, I'm fine. You guys are all idiots and need to go and see therapy. That's kind of how they think. So they're like soap dodging, therapy dodging. We've missed them. Like, and yet, there's a ton of evidence that shows that CBT can help people with anger. There's loads of psychological research that exposes what anger is and how it works. Kids should be taught this at school. No one tells them, basic stuff about how this emotion functions. And because it's dodged therapy, it's rampant on the internet, and social media is like a big anger machine or a rage farm. Politicians like love nothing more than to stoke some anger and hatred here and there. There's a lot of that around. Everybody hates everybody else's political candidate and tribe and whatnot. But we know a lot of stuff about anger and how it's kind of crazy. The Stoics called it temporary madness. It's I kind of like to think of it as the most self-defeating of all emotions. Like, angry people are like specialists. Angry people specialize in getting the opposite of what they actually want, I find. So I think there's a great deal that we can do there. It's this huge untapped mine of self-improvement potential. The internet's full of people doing self-improvement stuff, and half of them are pretty angry. Like, and it hasn't occurred to them to do anything about their anger fundamentally. So that's my thing. I'm writing a book about it. I constantly, I'm working with clients with anger problems and writing articles about it. and particularly how it relates to ancient Stoicism.
All right. Well, Donald Robertson, thank you so much for your time. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review and showing your support at patreon.com/podcastforinquiry. Email us podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. Help us support rational discourse and evidence-based decision-making by becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. CFIC is on the web, on Facebook, and you can follow us on Blue Sky at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Zach Dumont and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblatt. See you next time.